See, I told you we knew holiday classic. It's Obit. So please welcome Bruce Weber and Nancy Sharkey.
Thanks. So Bruce, let's get, the lights. We'll let our pupils recover. Your reaction to the documentary, you've seen it, what, about a dozen times now?
At least. A couple of things.
Like a...
Hello? Jeff said when he was introducing the film that you would like it, even though it didn't seem like it was going to be a really lively subject for a movie. And of course, this is exactly how we all felt when they told us they were going to make a movie about us. I thought, what? What are they going to look at? Me in front of a screen? And yeah, I guess that's what they were looking at. Actually, my reaction to the movie is what a great job the filmmakers did. Basically, all I did was go to work, and it's cut so beautifully, and it's thought through so well. The idea of how do you take a subject that really is suitable for the page and turn it into something that is, that's animated and suitable for the screen, I thought was ingenious the way they did that. So.
Yeah, so one of the lovely things that about the movie is that we really capture the way obits have changed in the last 20 years. More lively, not sort of the wooden stuff. But still, the way I regard obits, there's a certain kind of, people of a certain age go for the page, right? Do you think that that's true? Has that changed?
Well, there's an old joke. Every morning I wake up and I read the obits page, and if I'm not on it, then I know I'm still alive. And certainly the reaction that I get from people who read the New York Times and who are obits fans are that they've begun to read them more as they grow older. So yeah, I think there's a certain amount of truth to that.
And there's that great Roz Chast cartoon that they show.
There's that great Roz Chast cartoon in which you're looking over an elderly man's shoulder and he's reading the obits page, but all you can see are the headlines. Exactly your age, 2 years younger than your sister.
Well, as the old Onion joke goes, the Onion joke has it that the world death rate has held steady at 100%. So one thing that, given the interest in obits, one thing that I'm puzzled by is how fewer and fewer papers actually have obituary writers, or I think Paul called it obituarists, obituarians, obituaristas.
Well, I think the reason for that is pretty simple. That many newspapers around the country and around the world are facing limited. Their budgets are and their staffs are being reduced. And if you had to choose between covering Washington politics or covering an overseas war and covering obits, which one would you choose? I mean, I think it's that simple.
The Post, I think, has added a few under Bezos, right?
Yes.
That, I think, is a few obit writers under Bezos, but I think that's the only paper.
Yeah, the LA Times basically abolished their obit department about a year or two ago. So the Times and the Washington Post are pretty much the only two newspapers in the United States that are writing these kinds of obits on a regular basis. Of course, a lot of local newspapers publish obits, but they are of local people, and they're mostly for the people who live within the community.
Yeah, and a lot of them are paid death notices that are essentially the tributes and the kind of eulogies that the news obituary avoids. So when you left the Beat, and you, as you saw in the credits, a number of the obit writers and Jack Haddon, one of the editors, have taken buyouts or have left the paper. When you left, you wrote a terrific piece summarizing your career. 1,000 salutes to the departed, something like that. Age range 11 to 104. Name a profession. Scream queen, used car dealer, astronaut, guru, They all went on my watch. What were some of your favorites? Some of the more difficult, some of your more intriguing ones?
I would say that my favorite obit was Yogi Berra, and partly because he was a great subject, and partly because I'm a big baseball fan, and I grew up with Berra, and not only was he a wonderful player, but he was a wonderful character. So the obit was, I wouldn't say it was easy to write, but it was really fun to write, and the paper saw it that way too. They saw Berra as an extremely important, not only an athlete but a character. They put it above the fold on the front page, and it opened up into 2 full pages inside with big pictures, and it got a huge response. So, Roger, it was mentioned in writing by Roger Angell at the New Yorker and Ann Coulter. So,
Wow.
so it really kind of ran the gamut.
So it's just as he said, if you come to a fork in the road, take it.
That's right.
So,
I mean, the difficult obits were the ones about which I didn't know anything about what the person did. The economists, the mathematicians were always very complicated. In fact, whenever there was a famous mathematician to be done, there was kind of a lottery in the department, and the loser had to do the mathematician. Basically because you have to find a way to first understand what the person did, and then find a way to explain it in a way that's both accurate and understandable to a lay reader. And sometimes a mathematician or a philosopher or a physicist or a microbiologist, they might take 2 or 3 days to do.
I can't remember which.
For that very reason.
I can't remember which TV commentator said this, but your observation reminds me of what he said, that journalists are people who are paid to write about things they don't understand.
That's pretty much true. That's pretty much true. I used to say that a little bit flippantly, but that reporters are writers who don't really have anything of their own to say.
So, you in one of the spines of this narrative is your obituary of William Wilson, and you are presented as writing this breaking news obituary. On the breaking news, as opposed to advance obituaries, which are written, as we saw, sometimes years in advance, 80 years in advance in that one case, you have to work quickly. You don't have time to do the kind of reporting you would do for a profile. So coupled with a grieving family, it's a really hard task. How do you stay accurate and also proportionate, putting that person's life into the correct kind of context?
Well, I would say that I wrote obituaries for 8 years, and I would say that the ones that I wrote towards the end were better than the ones that I wrote at the beginning, for that very reason. The task seems incredibly daunting when you first begin, but you learn how to do it. I mean, you focus on the reason that you are writing the obituary in the first place. Usually, for a daily obit, there is 1 or perhaps 2 or maybe 3 things that the person you're writing about is known for, and you have to emphasize those and de-emphasize the other stuff that is kind of beside the point. So, and as I think a couple of people said in the film, sometimes the most difficult thing is dealing with the the personal details and getting somebody to confirm that the person has actually died. Talking with the families is not a small part of writing obituaries, and it's you kind of have to learn how to do that too. It took me a year or so. Excuse me, I have a terrible cough. It took me a year or so to recognize the fact that when I was calling someone, a family on the phone, that they were actually glad to hear from me. That an obituary in the New York Times, for a lot of people, whether for good or ill, it's deemed to be, a kind of honor, an acknowledgement of a newsworthy life, a life deemed worthy of attention. And the other thing is that the other thing that I began to recognize is that when someone's loved one dies, what they want to do is talk about them. I think that's true whether they were talking to a reporter from the New York Times, or talking to the postman, or talking to the butcher. So part of what you learn how to do is to talk to people as though you're simply having a conversation, because that's how the information comes out. And so that was an extremely valuable thing for me to learn. And I think I wrote this obit in 2014, so I was about 6 years into this job, and I think you can see that in the conversations that I was having with Melody Miller, William P. Wilson's wife, that it came out in a conversational way, and it really contributed to the success of the obituary.
Yeah, it doesn't always happen that way. So one obituary that I think was really striking and very, very sad for all of us at the times was David Carr, the obituary for David Carr. He died in the newsroom within an hour after moderating a panel with Ed Snowden, Glenn Greenwald, Laura Poitras. You had to write that obituary. It's 9 o'clock at night. Tell us what happened.
My wife and I were at home having dinner. And I got a phone call from Bill McDonald, who said that David Carr had died, and Dean wants the obituary. Dean Beckay, the executive editor of the paper, wants the obituary in tomorrow's paper. I got the call at 20 minutes to 10. I said, okay, I'll do it. And within 15 minutes, I had a call from the news desk. Where is it? So in addition to actually writing the obit, I was fending off the editors at the same time. Happily, my wife is an editor at the New York Times, and who knew David, and so she was doing some research for me. And there was another reporter, Ashley Southall, who was trying to get in touch with the family, which we actually never managed to do. But she dug up some of the personal information that we need. But it was a terribly grueling thing to do. I mean, we all knew David. I actually didn't know him that well, but the idea that a living, breathing person that you had seen just a few hours earlier was now going to be the subject of an obituary was a kind of a difficult sort of thing to swallow as I was doing it. I think in a certain way that was the kind of propulsion for the obit. Also the terror that I was going to miss the deadline. They said that it wouldn't make it into the paper at all if I didn't file by 12 o'clock, and I hit the button at 11:59. So.
Wow. Here's water I'll make this question a long one so you can get a drink. So for a while, the Times was publishing a series of video obits with subjects recorded in advance. Liz Smith did one, Hugh Hefner, John Glenn, Jimmy Breslin. My absolute favorite was Art Buchwald, because he comes on the screen. You look at the clip, you can still get it. Hi, I'm Art Buchwald, and I just died. What happened to those? Where did they go?
Well, my other favorite one, by the way,
oh, yeah,
was Ed Koch, who got on the screen and said, "Miss me yet?" Anyway, those things turned out to be. I actually wanted to do a few, but I was told that they were very labor-intensive, particularly in the editing room. So they stopped doing them because it took up too much time. I mean, you would go and interview someone for his obituary and talk to him for 2 hours or 2.5 hours. When Bill Carter did Dan Rather, he said he talked to him for 4 hours. And when Dan Rather dies, you'll see the result. But it's probably only going to be it's only an 8 or 10 or 12-minute piece. So that's the reason that they stopped doing them. I thought they were fantastic. I just thought they were great, and readers liked them too. But Yeah, and speaking of speaking of interviewing people for their advance obits, there's a great story. Clyde Haberman, who still writes for the paper, he retired, but he's now writing on the editorial board. He was given the assignment of writing the advance obituary of Punch Sulzberger, who was the longtime publisher of the New York Times. And he went up to Punch's apartment on I guess it was, where did he live? On the Upper West Side, and or was it Upper East?
Your call. I don't know. Somebody knows.
Anyway, he went up to his apartment, this very elegant space, and they sat down in Punch's study. Punch is sitting there, and Clyde said, "Punch, before we start, I got to tell you, this makes me a little uncomfortable." And Punch looked at him and said, "You."
So, on advance obits, there's a subset to Real Times aficionados of advance obits known as the obituary beyond the grave. So these are obituaries that are written by writers who have already died. So Elizabeth Taylor by Mel Gusso, Lillian Ross, Michael T. Kaufman, Bob Hope by Vincent Canby. Yeah, and then
not something any of us aspire to.
Yeah. But there was also the Fidel Watch, and one of the long advance obits was the Fidel Castro obit. That I think the first one was 1959, and I read that there were 16 different writers. I know about 8 of them who had to update it. And miraculously, I think Damien Cave was in Cuba when he died and was able to update that obit. Did you handle a lot of the updating for advance obits?
I did a few. I did Jerry Wexler, the music producer. I'm blanking on the Niederlander. Jerry Schoenfeld.
Schoenfeld, yeah.
And George Carlin. George Carlin.
Oh.
I rewrote George Carlin after he died.
Wow. So there's the advance obits. There's some great stories about actually getting in to interview people on their advance obits, including Punch. But there's a great set of stories about Alvin Krebs, who did a ton of advance obits on celebrities. Did you do a lot of advance obits yourself?
Yes, as a matter of fact. I would say probably 80. And there's about 45, between 45 and 50 that haven't run yet. But you were about to speak about the people who interview their subjects before they're dead. I never did that. I made a few inquiries. I tried to interview Tony Bennett for his obituary, but he declined. My favorite story in this regard is that I was asked to do Jack Nicholson's advance obit, and I called to ask if he, I called his agent to ask if he would be interested in speaking for his obit, and his agent said, "I've known this man for 50 years, and you want me to go to him with this? Are you kidding me? I realize you have to do your job, but I'm sorry, this is beyond the pale. I am just not going to do it." So people either get it or they don't.
Well, Krebs, I think, used to go with the pretext of doing a story. Betty Davis had some made-for-TV movie coming out, and he went to interview her, and she realized, she kind of got onto his act. She realized he's asking all these questions. She finally says, "You're writing my obituary, aren't you?" And he fessed up. Jenny Scott tells this story. He fessed up, and they'd been drinking tea. It was tea time, and she then disappeared into the kitchen, comes back out with a shaker of martinis and said, "In that case, why don't we get rid of this stupid tea and have a drink?" So you also did the Shirley MacLaine advance obit, right? You wrote about that.
I did. And very shortly after I finished Shirley MacLaine's obituary, she came out as the star in a movie called The Last Word, in which she plays a crabby old woman that nobody likes, who feels as though she's on her way out, and so she hires an obituary writer to write her obituary. And I can't tell this whole story because it's I don't want to send you to the movie because it's a perfectly crappy movie. But I would send you to the story that I wrote about this, in which I instructed the obituary writer in the movie what she did wrong. So.
You also said you thought it was odd that she had wanted to produce and star in a movie about obituaries, given that she believes in reincarnation and
Right.
doesn't go to funerals.
She doesn't go to funerals because these people are all coming back.
And for another, you said she herself already has an advance obituary. I know because I wrote it. So, finally, one of the things before we go to audience questions, Marguerite talks about the gender imbalance and her defense of the gender imbalance. This idea that there's this sliding window, and we're now looking at figures from the civil rights era into the 70s who are dying. We're seeing more women, more diversity. But, you know, every so often there's some academic study that comes out and says, well, only 10% of the obituaries are of women, fewer of minorities. What's your take on that? Where are we on that? How do you respond on that?
Well, I think what Margot says in the movie is accurate but incomplete. I've had conversations with several people in the newsroom who, who object to the fact that there are not enough, particularly not enough women in the obits. And what I always say to people is, tell us who we should do. It's not as though we're seeing people that we are judging worthy and saying, nah. And what a couple of good answers have come back in which that we need to expand the definition of what is newsworthy. There was an editor at the paper, a longtime editor named Nancy Newhouse, who said, you know, for 100 years, women have been doing the bulk of the charity work in this country, who have been, you know, raising money for charities and helping to give it away. And you never see that in the New York Times obits. I think that's a good point. Mm-hmm. I think that's a good point.
So your next project, I thought that last set of questions she asked each of you about your own mortality was interesting. You've now left the paper and your next project is a biography of Dr. O.
Right.
How is that going? How did that happen? Sorry. Well, I'm not standing here filming you typing. That would have driven me crazy. I could not write.
My stock answer these days is that I'm a year into the project and 6 months behind.
How did that happen? What's the focus?
I started my career in journalism as a fiction editor at Esquire, and I've always been interested in American fiction, and I've always wanted to, and I've particularly been interested in the connection between the writer's life and the writer's work. So I've had it in mind for many, many years that if the right subject came up, I'd like to write a literary biography. And as it happens, I wrote about Edgar Doctorow several times over my career, and I actually knew the man a little bit. And when he died in 2015, I thought, you know, this is the moment. So I wrote to the widow, and she was very enthusiastic. In fact, she's become a great supporter of the project. So that's how that happened.
And Richard Ford, you studied with Richard Ford. He remains a friend. You've written a bit about him. Any project with him in the future, do you see?
No, he's kind of a crabby guy. We just actually.
Well, Dr. O's dead. So.
My wife and I went up to visit Richard. I hadn't seen him in a while. He's, he has been one of the biggest influences on my life, and I've known him for 40 years, and he can't quite get over the fact that I'm not a student anymore. So, but I understand that, but it just bugs me.
So let's open, I'm sure you guys have plenty of questions. Let's open it up to audience questions. Yeah, right in the front.
How did you write obits of people you despised?
How did you write obits of people you despised?
Well, first of all, I didn't. The maybe half dozen times that I wrote obituaries of people that I knew, they were people that I liked. So, and even that is not, that's not an ideal. That's not an ideal thing. You run the risk of, kind of slipping over into eulogy. But certainly, I've written obits of criminals and white separatists and people like that, and they're just news reports basically. I mean, often the hardest thing about writing about a villain is calling the family, because because they don't want to talk about the fact that the guy doesn't want to say, yeah, my father was a bad guy, and he knows that that's what you're going to say in the paper. So those conversations can be a little dicey, but actually writing about villains is pretty easy. You just write about the villainy,
Yeah, in the blue shirt there.
A couple comments, a couple observations, a couple
Oh,
questions.
there's a mic coming down your way.
Sorry. First off, my father appeared in the New York Times obit. He was an eminent political scientist in the same era and generation as George Gallup and Lou Harris. And upon his death, I called the New York Times to tell them, because back in '99, the internet wasn't as pervasive as it is now. And since my father was world famous within his discipline of electoral behavior, I thought it would be good, coming from a journalism background myself, that the Times would be an excellent venue or forum to get the word out to all of his colleagues throughout the world. The reporter that I interacted with was Eric Pace, and it took 24 hours for him to get back to me to confirm that he was interested in doing this story, not only because of my father's importance, but because there was also another person with the very same name, Warren Miller, who's
the filmmaker.
Exactly, but my father is Warren E. Miller, and he was one of the first people who brought on this wave of pollsters, where your scientists were. So the question is, the question is, when I was interacting with Mr. Pace, I mean, he used his professional discretion, but does competition within your department ever play a place with the Washington Post, with whom I also was sharing the information, and also your classified section? Because Mr. Pace was saying, well, if we don't cover it, you can pay $20 a word and your father can still show up. So where does competition and propriety go when doing the story?
The obituaries desk is as competitive as any other desk at the paper. We don't want to be beaten on a national story by the Washington Post. As far as the classified's concerned, I don't know whether how Eric spoke to you, but what he was trying to tell you was, we're going to make a decision about whether or not we're going to publish it. If it doesn't happen, you can have you have the option of paying for a death notice. It's the discussions, as you saw, that go on at the desk are about whether or not this is a newsworthy situation for the readership of the New York Times. It's not perfect. There are between 55 and 60 million people in the world who die every day. Die every year. That's the population of Italy. And we run obituaries of about 1,200 of them. So there's a fairly serious triage that goes on.
There's a question over here and then one back there. Pascal, can you bring the mic?
Any guess as to why there was no mention of Alden Whitman?
Alden Whitman.
Yeah, actually, I think that's it's an omission in the film that I wish was there myself.
So, just who was Alden Whitman?
Alden Whitman was the famous obituary writer who brought the art of the obituary into prominence in the 1960s and the 1970s. There's a famous Esquire profile of Whitman by Gay Talese with the headline "Mr. Bad News." But yes, I think he's sort of the father of the modern obituary, and I'm sorry it's not in the movie myself.
A question back there.
Yeah, I have a question about the guy in the basement.
Yeah,
Jeff Roth.
Jeff Roth.
What's going to happen down there when he dies.
You know, it'll be a sad, sad day. Jeff is a wonderful guy, and you think he's eccentric here? You should see him. You should.
Your own obituary.
No, I haven't. I haven't. I don't know why people ask me that all the time. And the reason is, you know, I don't care what my obituary says. I mean, my wife might care if she's still around, but obituaries are for the living, you know. So I haven't written. That's the short answer.
That was another Alban Krebs moment. He interviewed Noel Coward and said he was collecting information to be used in the event of death. And Coward says, "Oh, my obituary. I don't mind. I'll be dead."
Yeah.
Question right there.
I always look at an obituary as a teacher
Mhm.
and think what a great way to introduce people to history, because it comes alive through the people. And history lives in the kid's mind when they have a life. I always turn to the obit because it teaches me more about history.
I'm glad to hear it.
And I wonder if there's any educational application of obituary as curriculum.
I'm sure there is. You know, I teach writing at the graduate school level, and I always assign my students to write obituaries, as a reporting exercise. But I think this is up to you. I think I think creating a curriculum around obituaries is your job. No.
Thank you.
And don't you think that what Marguerite was talking about the choices in the life, how the life comes to these turning points, free will, fate, that is also instructive for kids, don't you think?
Sure. Sure. I was going to say something else, but never mind.
No, go ahead.
You know, I love Margot Fox. I think she's great. But I think some of the things she says in this movie are. But
we have time for about 2 more questions. Yeah, go ahead.
In the yogi obit, did you mention his yogiism? The future ain't what it used to be.
you know,
I actually have that tattooed on my back.
I didn't mention that one. There were quite a number of yogiisms. You know, if you can't imitate them, don't copy them. You know, or maybe it was the other way around. I mean, or you know, if you come to a fork in the road, take it. That's always been my favorite.
Yeah, back there.
I wondered if are the obit writers involved at all in the magazine section called "The Lives They Live"?
No, we're not. It pisses us off.
Why?
Because very often they end up rewriting the obits that we've already written. I had a long and very pissy email exchange with Jake Silverstein, the editor of the magazine, on this very subject. He said, "Well, what are we supposed to do?" I said, "Find different people." He said, "But these are the most important people." I said, "Exactly, that's why we already wrote them." But anyway, no, the answer is no, and it makes us, it bothers.
In the gray t-shirt, yeah.
So I was wondering if you could comment on a particular obit that affected you more emotionally than others, or affected you emotionally in a surprising way.
Well, as I said, there were about half a dozen that I wrote of people that I knew, and those were always a little dicey. There was one about a theater director in Chicago, a guy named Michael Maggio, who had a really moving story. He had had cystic fibrosis and had a double lung transplant. He would have died in like 20 minutes if he hadn't had this operation. And after the operation, he went from being a skeletal guy, hauling around an oxygen tank to bouncing around like a soccer player. And he had 10 years of life before the reaction of his body to the drugs that he was taking killed him. And he was a pal of mine, and so that was a difficult one to write. And as a result, I don't think it was very good. One that was, the David Carr obit was a tough one, for obvious reasons. Philip Seymour Hoffman was not was moving to me because I actually knew Phil a little bit. He lived in our neighborhood, and I would see him around. I mean, I didn't know him well. And then finally, there was an 11-year-old girl, a child actor who had appeared in The Lion King, and she died of leukemia. And try and write an obituary of an 11-year-old. I mean, it's the occasion is so sad. Plus, it was only 11 years of life. It was a very achy experience. So.
And one more question. Yeah, right there, big hand raised, 5 fingers.
Are you going to be at the Tucson Festival of Books?
When is it? In March? All somebody has to do is invite me. I'm happy to come.
So thank you so much for all of the conversation today. We will move out, and if folks do want to come up, say hi to Bruce. If you've read Life as a Wheel, his memoir of riding across the country, or Umpire, his book about being a major league spring training umpire, little league umpire, will be out in the hall. We've got to clear the auditorium for the next film. So thanks, Bruce.
Thank you, Ben.